At 73, Robert Morris had built a life from the ground up. Raised in a small Kansas town, he worked tirelessly to turn his family's dreams into reality. A widower now, Robert finds himself living with his son, Alan. In his family, an arrangement he never expected but hoped would bring him peace. Alan, his only son, a man in his 40s, had always been a source of pride. But lately, things had changed. It wasn't the retirement that hurt Robert, it was the way he was treated now. Alan, a successful businessman working in the very company Robert had founded, had begun to act like his father was a burden. Robert didn't mind being in the background, but the disrespect he faced every day was unbearable. Alan's wife, Margaret, was equally dismissive, making it clear that Robert's presence in their home was less than welcome. One fateful evening, after a routine doctor's appointment, Alan, in a fit of frustration, called Robert a useless old man in front of his granddaughter, Sarah. For a moment, Robert froze. The words stung, but they did more than that. They ignited a fire deep within him. You see, Alan had no idea that his useless old man was actually the owner of the company. He worked for the very company he had built from scratch. Robert wasn't done yet. The time had come for Alan to learn just who his father really was. The morning after the confrontation, Robert woke up early, his mind racing with thoughts of what had transpired. The words Alan had thrown at him, harshness, the lack of understanding echoed in his mind, but he didn't let them control him. He had lived a long life, built an empire with his own hands, and had seen enough to know that sometimes the best response wasn't one that came in anger. It was one that came in silence, action, and dignity. He stood before the mirror, adjusting his shirt, a quiet determination in his eyes. He had always believed in doing things the right way, no matter how difficult it was. And today, it was time for Alan to learn that lesson. Robert hadn't just been sitting idle for the past few years. His company, Morris Manufacturing, was still. Still carrying his Namond, he knew its inner workings better than anyone, even though he hadn't been hands-on in years. Alan may have taken over many aspects of the business, but Robert was the cornerstone on which it was built. His company was not just a legacy of hard work. It was the result of his integrity, his sacrifice, and his vision. He made his way to the office, the place he had spent so many years shaping into something successful, something that had provided for not just his family, but for so many others in their town. The receptionist greeted him with respect, remembering the man who had started it all. He nodded to her as he made his way to the back office, where he met with the legal team and his old colleague, Mark, who had been with him since the early days. "Mr. Morris, how can we help today?" Mark asked, surprised to see him. Robert hadn't been to the office in months, but today, something had shifted. "I need a full review of the company's records, specifically Alan's performance," Robert said calmly. "It's time I get a look at what's really been going on." The legal team, aware of Robert's quiet authority, didn't hesitate. They handed him the files, the ones that contained everything Alan's performance reports, his interactions with clients, and the internal memos that spoke volumes about his behavior in the company. Robert didn't flinch as he went through them. The evidence was clear. Alan had been taking liberties with company resources, showing up late, misusing company vehicles, and even neglecting his responsibilities as a manager. The more Robert read, the more he realized how much his son had strayed from the values he had tried to instill in him. Alan had taken it all for granted, the company, the family legacy, the sacrifices Robert had made. But that wouldn't be the legacy he left behind. Robert knew that if Alan wanted to truly succeed, he would have to learn responsibility, humility, respect for what had come before him. He didn't waste time with petty words. Instead, Robert did what he had always done. He acted. He made a call to the board of directors, requesting an emergency meeting. The room filled with quiet murmurs as Robert entered. Alan wasn't there yet, but the tension was palpable. Robert didn't need to raise his voice. His presence was enough. When the meeting started, he laid everything out. He showed the board the report on Alan's behavior, backed by hard evidence. There were no excuses, no defenses. Alan's actions spoke for themselves. Robert didn't ask for any special treatment, simply made it clear that he would not allow favoritism to cloud the company's integrity. "Alan has been given more than enough chances," Robert said, his voice steady but unwavering. "He cannot meet the standards we set here. then he does not belong in a leadership position. It's time for him to face the consequences. The board members exchanged glances, some surprised, others relieved. They had all seen the signs of Alan's decline, but no one had dared to speak up. Robert's decision was final. Alan would be removed from his position, but not without a fair process. His rights would be protected. But there would be no special treatment. Robert returned home that evening, his heart heavy but at peace. He knew that this wasn't about punishing his son. It was about teaching him. He wasn't angry, just disappointed in how Alan had chosen to ignore the values Robert had spent a lifetime building. At dinner, the silence was thick. Alan avoided looking at him. Margaret's eyes were filled with judgment, and Sarah, too young to understand, ate quietly. Robert didn't try to fill the silence with words. He simply went about his meal. His calm presence, a stark contrast to the storm that had just passed through their family. Later that night, as Robert sat in the living room, he reflected on the life he had built, on the family that had been so close, and on the legacy he had tried to pass on. He had always been a man of few words, but the silence he had chosen to carry in the face of adversity was speaking louder than any argument ever could. Alan would learn. Eventually, he would understand. But for now, Robert had done his part. The lesson had been taught, and the rest was up to Alan to figure out. The days that followed were heavy with silence, each moment dragging on like the last. Robert woke up early every morning, not for any particular reason other than habit. He had always been an early riser, used to the quiet of the morning and the feeling of the world still asleep. But this time the house felt different. It was as if the walls themselves were holding their breath, waiting for something to shift, something to change. Alan had not spoken to him since the meeting. Margaret kept her distance too, her eyes filled with judgment that seemed to linger in every corner of the room. Robert didn't let it bother him, though. He had long since learned that, when life hits hard, the best thing to do is stay calm, keep your head up, and wait for the storm to pass. As he sat at the kitchen table, sipping his coffee, he couldn't help but think back to the days when Alan was a boy. Those were the moments that kept him going, memories of a time when everything seemed simpler. Robert remembered the long drives to get Alan's school supplies, the days spent fixing bikes together in the garage, the sacrifices he had made for his son's future. He had always done his best for Alan, worked tirelessly to give him a life full of opportunities. But now, it seemed all that hard work, all that sacrifice, had been forgotten. He thought about the early days of the company, back when it was just a small workshop with a few worn-out tools. Robert had started with nothing but the desire to build something lasting, and he had done it slowly, step by step. Over the years, he had seen something in Alan that worried him, a sense of entitlement, a belief that success was something that just happened, rather than something earned. He had seen it all too clearly when Alan had taken the company for granted, treating it as if it were his to command, without understanding the hard work and integrity that had built it. One afternoon, Robert decided it was time to do something. He had been patient long enough, but he couldn't let this go on. It wasn't just about the business anymore. It was about his son's future and the man he was becoming. He couldn't change Alan's path for him, but he could show him what it meant to be a man of character. He left the house, driving through town, the familiar streets feeling different now. Robert made his way to the old office, the place where it had all started. As he stepped inside, the memories came rushing back. He walked through the familiar halls, greeted by old employees who still remembered the man who had built this company with his own two hands. They didn't know the full story, of course. They didn't know what had happened at home, the toll it had taken on Robert. But they respected him. They respected what he had done. He sat down in the boardroom where he had made so many decisions over the years. The board members filed in, looking at him with a mix of curiosity and respect. They had all heard the rumors about the tension between Robert and his son, but no one had dared to speak openly about it. Robert didn't waste time with pleasantries. He laid everything out, calm and collected, just as he had always been. Alan has been given every opportunity, Robert said, his voice steady. But I can't let him continue like this. The company means too much to me, and it means too much to the people who depend on it. I'm not asking for sympathy, but I am asking for respect for the values that this company was built on." The board members were quiet, absorbing his words. They had seen the decline in Alan's performance, but no one had wanted to make a decision. Robert's words were a wake-up call. He wasn't asking for Alan to be punished, but he was making it clear that the company's future couldn't be compromised. "I've seen what Alan's become," Robert continued, "and I won't allow that to be the face of this company. We need someone who understands what it means to work hard, to build something from the ground up. Alan has lost sight of that. There was no argument, no debate. The decision was made. Alan would be removed from his position, not in a humiliating way, but in a way that showed the company's commitment to its values." Robert wasn't doing this out of spite. He was doing it because it was necessary. For the good of the business, for the good of his son, and for the good of the legacy he had worked so hard to build. When he returned home that evening, the atmosphere was even more tense than before. Alan hadn't spoken a word, and Margaret avoided looking at him. Robert didn't try to fill the silence. He simply went about his evening as usual, eating his meal, helping Sarah with her homework, and keeping to himself. Later that night, as he sat in his favorite chair, Robert knew that he had done what he had to do. It wasn't about being right or wrong. It was about doing what was necessary. And sometimes, the hardest decisions were the ones that involved those you loved most. Alan would understand eventually. Robert wasn't asking for an apology or recognition. He had done this for the future, for the lessons that Alan needed to learn. It wasn't too late for him to change, but the first step had to come from within. And Robert knew that, in the silence, in the quiet decisions he had made, he had done all he could to show Alan what it meant to be a man of integrity. The days after Robert's decision were strange, as if the world around him had shifted into an unfamiliar rhythm. The house was quieter now, and even though he didn't expect immediate changes, there was something different in the air of tension that couldn't be ignored. Alan hadn't said a word to him since the meeting with the board. Neither had Margaret. They were both keeping their distance, and Robert didn't mind. He had lived long enough to know that sometimes silence spoke louder than words ever could. Robert spent his time doing what he always did. He woke up early, made his coffee, and sat on the porch, watching the world wake up. His mind often wandered back to the early days of his business, back when every penny mattered, and every success felt like a victory won from the sweat of his brow. The quiet mornings on the porch were his time to reflect, to think about his legacy and the man he had become. But as much as he tried to stay detached from the chaos in the house, he couldn't help but wonder what Alan was thinking. Never been one to ask for things, he had built his life by working hard, making decisions, and sticking to his principles. But now, as he watched his son avoid him, Robert began to feel a pang of regret. Not regret for his actions, he had done what he had to do, but regret that Alan had turned into someone who didn't see the value in hard work, in family, or in the legacy that had been handed down to him. One evening, after dinner, Robert sat in his favorite chair by the window, watching the sunset. It had been a long time since he had truly felt at peace with his choices, but something in him told him that he had done the right thing. He had given Alan every opportunity, a chance to prove himself. But now it was time for his son to face the consequences of his actions. Robert had always believed that in order to grow, sometimes you had to be pushed. Sometimes you had to hit rock bottom before you could truly rise. And that's what Robert had done. He had set the stage for Alan to make his own choices, to take responsibility for the man he wanted to become. The next morning, Robert decided to take a walk. He hadn't walked around town in a while, but today, something felt different. The sun was out, and the sky was a clear blue, reminding him of the days when he had worked alongside his employees, when every task felt like a challenge, and every challenge felt like an opportunity. As he walked, he passed by old neighbors, who smiled and waved, recognizing the man who had built something from nothing. Their respect was something Robert hadn't realized he needed. But now, it was clear this respect, this recognition, was the result of years of hard work and sacrifice. By the time he returned home, Robert felt a sense of clarity. It was time. to stop second-guessing himself. He had made the decision he needed to make, not just for the company, but for his family. He couldn't live forever, and as much as it hurt, he couldn't protect Alan from the lessons that life had to teach. That evening, Alan finally spoke to him. It wasn't much, just a few words, but it was a start. "Dad," Alan said, his voice tinged with uncertainty, "I've been thinking a lot about what you said, about the company, about everything. I've made mistakes. I know I have."
What?
Looked at his son, and for the first time in a long time, he saw the man Alan could be. "I know you have, son," Robert said gently, his voice steady. "But it's never too late to turn things around. You have the strength to do it, but it starts with you. It's not about the company or the mistakes you've made. It's about who you are and who you want to become." Alan nodded. And for the first time, Robert saw a glimmer of something he hadn't seen in years: humility. It wasn't an apology. It was something more important. A recognition of the responsibility that Alan had to take for his own actions. The next few weeks passed by in a quiet, yet significant way. Alan began to take on more responsibility, not just at work, but in his personal life. He started showing up on time, working with his colleagues, and most importantly, taking pride in the company his father had built. It wasn't an overnight transformation, but Robert could see the change. His son was starting to understand the value of hard work, and that meant more to Robert than anything else. One afternoon, as Robert was sitting on the porch, Alan came out and sat beside him. For a moment, neither of them spoke. It was the kind of silence that came with understanding, with the recognition that sometimes words weren't necessary. "I'm sorry, Dad," Alan finally said, his voice low but sincere. "I didn't get it. I didn't understand, but I do now. I want to make you proud." Robert smiled, the kind of smile that came from deep within his chest. "You've already made me proud, Alan. You're my son. But remember, it's not about me. It's about you. It's about what you choose to do with your life from here on out." In that moment, Robert realized that his legacy wasn't just about the business he had built. It was about the lessons he had passed down, the quiet strength he had shown, and the wisdom he had imparted. Not through words, but through action. The future was uncertain. But Robert knew one thing for sure. His son was finally on the path to becoming the man he was always meant to be. And that was all Robert could ever ask for. The days began to feel a little quieter around Robert's house. But the silence wasn't entirely uncomfortable. Alan had been spending more time at work, and Margaret had taken to retreating into her own space, leaving Robert to find his rhythm again. He didn't mind it much. He had spent a lifetime navigating the noise of business, family, and expectations. It was in these moments of solitude that Robert truly began to reflect on the years gone by, the hard decisions he had made, and the lessons he had learned along the way. It wasn't easy, this letting go. Watching Alan struggle had hurt him more than he had expected. He'd hoped his son would simply take the reins of the business with the same integrity and determination that Robert had. But it had become clear that Alan wasn't ready. There had been too much handed to him too quickly, and he had taken it for granted. Still, Robert knew that if he were to truly help his son, he needed to let him fall. He needed to let Alan make his own choices, face his own consequences. Over the next week, Robert took on small tasks around the house, things that didn't require much effort, but kept his mind occupied. He fixed a leaky faucet, mended the fence in the backyard, and even took on the task of planting a few flowers along the front porch. His movements were slow, deliberate, as if each task gave him the time to think through the choices he had made. One evening, after dinner, Robert sat down in his favorite chair by the window and watched as the last rays of sunlight slipped away. Behind the horizon, air was thick with the quiet of the evening. Alan, to his surprise, sat down next to him. He was different. Somehow his usual arrogance had been replaced with something more humble, more reflective. For the first time in what felt like forever, Robert didn't feel like he had to say anything. "I've been thinking a lot about everything." "Dad," Alan started, his voice quiet, "about the company, about what you've built, about me." Robert turned his head, meeting his son's gaze. "I know you've made mistakes, Alan," Robert said, his voice calm but firm. But it's never too late to make it right. It's not about the company or the mistakes you've made. It's about who you are and who you want to be moving forward. Alan nodded slowly, as if letting his father's words sink in. The silence stretched between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that comes with understanding. Silence that didn't need to be filled with more words. Alan wasn't asking for forgiveness. He wasn't even looking for validation. He was simply acknowledging the lessons Robert had tried to teach him. The days that followed saw small changes in Alan. He started showing up on time for work, taking responsibility for his actions, and working alongside his colleagues with a sense of pride that had been absent for so long. Margaret, too, had softened. She hadn't said much, but the way she looked at Robert now with judgment and more with respect spoke volumes. Robert didn't expect an overnight transformation. He knew better than that. Change took time, and Alan had a long road ahead of him, but there was hope now. Hope that his son might one day understand the value of hard work, integrity, and sacrifice. One afternoon, as Robert was sitting on the porch with his coffee, Alan came outside and joined him. They sat together in silence, watching the world go by. For a moment, it felt like nothing had changed. But then Alan turned to him. "Dad," he said, his voice low, "I just wanted to thank you for everything. But I'm going to make it right. I'm going to prove to you that I can be the man you always thought I could be." Robert smiled, a small, knowing smile. "You don't have to prove anything to me, Alan. You just need to prove it to yourself. But I'm proud of you. I'm proud of the man you're becoming." Alan nodded, his eyes filled with gratitude. And for the first time in a long time, Robert felt the weight of the years lift off his shoulders. There was no grand gesture, no dramatic apology. There was just the quiet understanding between father and son. It was in the way they both knew that the road ahead would be difficult, but it would be one they could walk together. As the weeks passed, Robert watched his son grow, slowly but surely, into the man he had always hoped he would become. Alan didn't just take over the business. He started taking ownership of his life. He worked hard, showed up for his family, and, most importantly, began to understand the true value of everything Robert had worked so hard to build. One evening, as Robert sat on the porch, Alan came outside and handed him a small worn-out box. "This is for you, Dad," Alan said, his voice steady. Inside the box was a picture of Robert, Alan, and Margaret from years ago, reminder of the family they had been, and the family they were becoming once again. Robert held the picture. In his hands, feeling a lump in his throat, there was no need for words. Alan had given him what he had needed all along: acknowledgement, respect, and a promise to carry on the legacy that had been built with sweat and sacrifice. The future was uncertain, but one thing was clear: this was a new beginning for them. Both. The days after Robert's decision were filled with a strange kind of peace. It wasn't the silence of emptiness, but a silence that came with knowing that, for better or worse, the hard choices had been made. Alan, still absorbing the weight of his father's actions, had started to spend more time at work. There was a shift in his demeanor, less arrogance, more humility. Margaret, too, had softened. She hadn't said much, but Robert could see it in her eyes. The tension in the house had diminished, but it was clear that a new understanding was growing, one that took time to form. Robert, ever the man of routine, didn't let the change in the house disrupt his own way of living. He went back to the things that grounded him, the small tasks, the daily routines that kept him busy. There was always something that needed fixing around the house, a broken faucet or a squeaky door. These small chores, though seemingly insignificant, gave Robert a sense of purpose. They were familiar tasks, the kind he had always handled with skill and care. But even as he focused on these little things, Robert couldn't ignore the quiet changes unfolding before him. Alan had started showing up earlier for work, taking more responsibility, working side by side with his employees. He wasn't the same man who had stormed into the house, angry and entitled. There was something different about him now. Something that Robert couldn't quite put his finger on, but something he knew was real. Alan was learning to appreciate the value of hard work, of showing up when it mattered most, of putting in the effort not just for the company, but for himself. One evening, after a long day of tinkering with an old piece of equipment in the garage, Robert sat on the porch with a glass of iced tea. The sun had just set, casting a soft orange glow over the quiet street. He had been working on a new project, something small but meaningful, a gift for Sarah. She had been asking him for weeks to help her build a birdhouse, and today Robert finally decided to make it happen. It was simple, really just a few pieces of wood, some nails, and a little paint. But as he sat back and admired his work, he couldn't help but feel a sense of accomplishment. It was then that Alan came outside, a hesitant look on his face. He stood for a moment, watching his father, and then slowly walked over to the porch. There was an air of quiet uncertainty about him, but there was also something new in the way he carried himself. "Dad," Alan began, his voice quieter than usual. "Can we talk?" Robert nodded, setting his glass down on the small table beside him. "Of course, son. What's on your mind?" Alan took a seat beside him, looking down at his hands before meeting Robert's gaze. "I've been thinking about what you said, about me, about the company. I know I've let you down. I've been too focused on what I thought was mine, and I didn't see the bigger picture. Didn't see how much you sacrificed, how much you built, just so I could have this life." Robert listened, his face calm but thoughtful. It wasn't the apology he had expected, but it was more than he could have asked for. It wasn't just words, it was an understanding, a recognition of the weight of Robert's decisions, and the lessons he had tried to pass on. "I've been running from my mistakes, trying to fix everything without facing the truth," Alan continued. "But I think I finally get it. I get that what matters isn't just the business or the money or the power. It's about integrity. It's about doing the right thing, even when no one's looking." Robert didn't respond immediately. He simply nodded, allowing his son the space to speak. This was a conversation Robert had wanted for so long, and yet he had never known how to start it. Now it was happening on its own, with Alan taking the first steps toward understanding what Robert had spent his life trying to teach him. "I don't know if I can fix everything right away," Alan said, his voice filled with sincerity. "I want to try. I want to show you that I'm serious about this, that I'm serious about making things right. I want to be the man you always believed I could be." Robert didn't rush to answer. He let the words hang in the air between them. This wasn't about forgiveness, it was about growth. And Robert knew that Alan was finally ready to begin that journey. "You've already taken the first step," Robert said quietly, placing a hand on his son's shoulder. "Now, you just have to keep walking. It won't always be easy, but No, you can do it. You've got the strength, Alan. You just need to believe in yourself the way I've always believed in you." There was a long pause, and then Alan smiled. It was a small, uncertain smile, but it was enough to show Robert that something had shifted inside his son. The road ahead would be long, and there would be challenges to face. But for the first time in a long while, Robert felt a sense of hope. His son was on the right path, and for the first time, Alan was ready to take ownership of his own future. As the evening wore on, they sat together in silence, watching the stars appear one by one in the sky above. For the first time in years, Robert felt that the family he had built was finally beginning to heal. It wasn't perfect, and it would take time, but it was a start. And sometimes, that's all a man can ask for. The days passed by with a slow but steady rhythm in Robert's house. Alan continued to show more responsibility at work, keeping his commitments and handling his tasks with a newfound sense of diligence. Robert observed these changes from a distance, choosing not to speak too much about them, knowing that real growth often happened quietly without fanfare. Alan's actions spoke louder than any words could, and Robert could see the transformation. In his son, even if it was still in its early stages, Margaret, too, seemed to be adjusting. She no longer looked at Robert with the same disdain she had in the past. Their interactions were more civil, though there was still a certain distance between them. Robert didn't mind. He'd lived a long time, and he knew that relationships, like the seasons, often needed time to change. The most important thing was that there was no more tension in the house, no more angry words or cold silences. Things were quieter, softer, but there was a sense of calm settling over them all. One morning, Dot on the porch, a cup of coffee in his hands, looking out over the yard. The morning sun was just beginning to rise, casting a warm golden glow over everything. He had always enjoyed this time of day, the stillness, the quiet beauty of the world coming to life. He took a deep breath, appreciating the simple things he had come to love in his later years: the smell of fresh coffee, the sound of birds chirping, the feeling of the cool breeze on his skin. It was during this quiet moment that Alan stepped out onto the porch and sat down beside him. Robert didn't need to say anything. He could tell that his son had something on his mind. Alan's face was still young, but there was a maturity in his eyes now, a depth that hadn't been there before. He looked at Robert, and for the first time in a long while, there was no tension between them. Just the quiet understanding of two men who had both endured their share of struggles. "Dad," Alan began, his voice hesitant but steady. "I've been thinking a lot about everything, the company, what you've built, the way I've treated you, and I know I've been wrong. I know I've let you down, and I've let myself down too." Robert listened quietly, his gaze never leaving the horizon. He didn't need to rush Alan or push him for more. The words were already there. They were coming from a place of sincerity that Robert had longed to hear. "I've been running away from my mistakes for so long," Alan continued, "and I've realized that I can't do that anymore. Not just about the company, or the money, or the title I thought I deserved. It's about respect for you, for what you've built, and for myself. I've got a lot of work to do, Dad, and I want you to know I'm ready to do it." Nodded slowly, a sense of peace washing over him. This wasn't about some grand apology. It wasn't about fixing everything in one conversation. It was about the beginning of something more important: understanding, accountability, and the willingness to change. And for the first time in years, Robert felt like Alan was finally stepping into the man he was meant to be. "You've already taken the hardest step," Robert said softly, looking over at his son. "You've faced the truth, and that's the first step to making things right. It won't be easy, Alan, but you have the strength to do it. I've always known you did." There was a long pause, and then Alan turned to look at his father. His eyes filled with a mix of gratitude and something deeper, newfound respect. "Thanks, Dad," Alan said quietly. "I'm going to do this. I promise." Robert smiled, the kind of smile that only comes from a place of deep, quiet understanding. He didn't need Alan to promise anything. The truth was already in Alan's actions. He had begun the hard work of rebuilding his life, and Robert knew that, in time, things would fall into place. The silence between them was comfortable now. It's a kind of silence that only comes from years of shared experience and mutual respect. It was a silence that spoke volumes, a silence that told Robert all he needed to know. His son was on the right path, and Robert's work was done. As the sun rose higher in the sky, Robert took a final sip of his coffee and set the cup down. He felt a deep sense of contentment, knowing that despite all the struggles and challenges, they had made it through. Alan was still his son, but he was also becoming his own man. And that was all Robert had ever wanted to see his son stand. On his own 2 feet, with dignity and honor. The future was still uncertain. But for the first time in a long while, Robert was at peace. The lessons had been learned, and the journey wasn't over yet. But for now, it was enough. It was more than enough. The days following Alan's quiet confession were filled with an unusual sense of calm. But it wasn't the kind of peace Robert had grown accustomed to. This time, it wasn't born of solitude or a comfortable routine. It was the peace of knowing that Alan was beginning to take responsibility. That he was finally moving toward the man Robert had always hoped he would become. The house was quieter. Now, not in the sense of being empty, but in the way that comes with reconciliation. The kind of silence that settles in when things begin to heal. Alan didn't change overnight. Robert knew better than to expect that. Change, true change, took time. But every small action, every time Alan took a little more responsibility, every time he worked harder or showed up on time was a step forward. Robert didn't need to see grand gestures. Didn't need Alan to apologize or promise him anything more than he had already shown. All Robert needed was the quiet acknowledgement that Alan was trying, and that was enough. It was early one morning when Alan came to. Him again. Robert had been sitting on the porch, enjoying the first light of day, a hot cup of coffee in his hands. He had always been a man who found peace in these moments, the quiet mornings, the simplicity of a sunrise, the steady rhythms of life that seemed to move a little slower when you were older. It was in these moments that Robert reflected on everything he had built, everything he had sacrificed, everything he hoped for in the future. Alan approached slowly, as if unsure how to begin. Robert looked up and smiled, inviting his son to sit beside him. There was no rush, no expectation. Alan had already said what needed to be said. Now, they simply had to live with the changes that would follow. "Dad," Alan said, his voice low but steady. "I've been thinking a lot about things lately, about everything, really. I've been doing better at work, but it's more than that. I'm starting to understand what you've always been trying to tell me, even when I didn't. Want to hear it?" Robert nodded, his expression calm but his heart swelling with quiet pride. This wasn't just about Alan showing up on time or doing his job well. It was about Alan recognizing the value of the lessons Robert had spent his life trying to pass down. It was about seeing his son finally take ownership of his actions, to no longer blame others or look for excuses. Robert had always known Alan had it in him, but now, for the first time, Alan was beginning to see it too. "I know I've been selfish," Alan continued, his eyes looking out at the horizon, as if searching for the right words. "I didn't realize how much you sacrificed for me, for all of us. You worked so hard, and I took it for granted. I thought I could just coast, you know? But I see now that it's about more than just taking what's given to you. It's about earning it. It's about respecting what's been built." Robert didn't interrupt. He didn't need to. He just sat there, listening to his son, letting Alan speak his mind.
Always.
This moment, right here, was everything Robert had wanted. It wasn't a grand apology, but it was something far more valuable: self-awareness, humility, and a willingness to change. Alan wasn't just apologizing for the past. He was taking the first steps toward creating a future he could be proud of. "You've always said that life isn't about what we have, but about what we build," Alan continued, his voice gaining strength. "And I finally get it. It's not just about the company or the money or anything like that. It's about character. It's about doing the right thing, even when no one's watching." Robert smiled, the kind of smile that only comes after years of waiting for this moment. "That's right, Alan," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "It's not about the things we have, but about what we leave behind, the legacy we create with our choices. It's about how we treat the people we love, how we work, and how we face our mistakes." Alan looked at him then, his eyes filled with a mix of gratitude and determination. "I'm going to do better, Dad. Not just for the company, but for myself. I don't want to just be the man who inherits everything. I want to be the man who earns it." Robert felt a weight lift from his chest. It wasn't a burden lifted by Alan's apology, but by the simple act of his son beginning to understand the responsibility he had to carry. Robert didn't need Alan to fix everything right away. He didn't need him to become perfect overnight. He just needed Alan to keep moving forward, to keep making the right choices, even when it was hard. And from what Robert could see, that was exactly what Alan was ready to do. The morning sun had risen higher in the sky, casting its warm light on them both. For the first time in years, Robert felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in a long time. The road ahead would be long, and there would still be bumps along the way. But for the first time, Robert believed that Alan was truly on the path to becoming the man he was always meant to be. As the day began, Robert looked at his son, his pride evident in the quiet way he spoke. "I'm proud of you, Alan. I always have been. One of mine. Proud of the man you're becoming." Alan smiled, and for the first time in a long while, Robert saw the man he had always hoped Alan would be, the man who would carry the legacy forward. Not just in business, but in life. And in that moment, Robert knew that everything he had built was in good hands. The weeks that followed Alan's confession were filled with a quiet transformation. It wasn't a change that was immediately visible to the outside world, but Robert could feel it in the small, everyday moments. Alan was making an effort. He was more present at work, more attentive at home, and most importantly, he seemed to be facing up to his mistakes. It wasn't easy. Alan had years of habits to undo, and Robert knew that change would take time. But the difference was clear. Alan was no longer the entitled, angry man who had once looked at him with contempt. Instead, he was a son who was beginning to understand the weight of responsibility, both in life and in business. One afternoon, as Robert sat on the porch, savoring a quiet moment with his coffee, Alan came outside. There was no grand gesture, no dramatic speech, just the simple act of his son sitting down beside him. The air was cooler than usual for that time of year, and the soft rustling of leaves in the breeze added a sense of calm to the moment. "You know, Dad," Alan began, his voice a little hesitant, "I've been thinking a lot about the company, about what you've built. I've spent so much time taking it for granted, thinking it was just something I was entitled to. But I see now everything you did, all the sacrifices, the work you put in. It wasn't just about building a business. It was about building something real, something lasting." Robert took a slow sip of his coffee, watching his son carefully. There was a sincerity in Alan's voice that he hadn't heard before. It was a softening, a humbling that had taken time to develop. For so long, Alan had believed that success was just a given, that his place in the world was something he could take for granted. But now, it seemed like he was finally starting to understand that true success came with responsibility and respect. "I've been blind, Dad," Alan continued, his voice growing more confident. "I've been so focused on what I thought I deserved that I never took the time to see what you actually built. It's not just a business, it's a legacy. And I want to be a part of that legacy, but I know I have to earn it." Robert looked at Alan, really looked at him for the first time in a long while. He wasn't just his son now. He was a man who was finally stepping up, acknowledging the weight of the choices he had made, and understanding the responsibility that came with being part of something bigger than himself. "You're doing well, Alan," Robert said, his voice steady. "I've seen the changes in you. I don't expect perfection. I never did. But I've seen you take responsibility for your actions, and that's what matters. You're building something now, not just the company, but yourself." Alan nodded, a small, thoughtful smile tugging at the corners of his mouth.
"I've
"Got a long way to go, but I'm committed to making it right. I want to be someone you can be proud of, someone who respects what you've done and continues that work with integrity." Robert didn't say anything more. He didn't need to. This wasn't about words, it was about actions, about the steady, quiet work of rebuilding trust, of making amends in the small, everyday decisions. Alan was on the right path, and Robert knew it. That evening, as they sat together in the quiet of the house, Alan shared more about his plans for the company. He spoke with a new sense of purpose, a clear vision of what he wanted to accomplish. He talked about improving efficiency, fostering stronger relationships with the employees, and most importantly, building the kind of company that would continue to thrive not because of what it could offer financially, but because of the way it treated people, clients and family alike. Robert listened, his heart swelling with pride. This was the son he had always hoped for, the one who would take the reins of the company and continue the legacy of hard work, respect, and integrity. Alan wasn't there yet, but he was on his way. That was enough. The following week saw Alan continue to make strides. He took on new challenges at work, made difficult decisions with the business, and started fostering relationships with employees that were based on mutual respect. Margaret, too, noticed the change. She didn't speak much about it, but Robert could see the way she looked at Alan no longer with frustration, but with a quiet respect. She was seeing her husband's son as a man who was beginning to stand on his own, someone who was finally ready to take the reins. One evening after a long day of work, Alan came home and sat down with Robert on the porch. He didn't say much, but the way he sat there, beside his father, quiet but steady, spoke volumes. Robert didn't need Alan to express gratitude or to tell him that everything was fixed. He could see the change in him, and that was enough. The future was still uncertain, and there would be challenges ahead. But Robert knew one thing for sure: his son was on the right path. And in that quiet moment, with the stars beginning to shine in the sky above them, Robert felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. The legacy wasn't just his anymore. It was Alan's too. And it was in good hands. As the weeks passed, Robert could sense a quiet shift in his family. Things weren't perfect, and they weren't supposed to be. Life rarely handed out perfect moments, especially after the storms that had shaken his family's foundation. But there was a new sense of understanding, a subtle change in the air that he hadn't noticed before. Alan was still Alan, his son, with all his flaws and imperfections, but he was also becoming something else. He was becoming a man who was willing to face his past, to take responsibility for his actions, to make things right. Robert didn't expect a grand transformation, and he wasn't disappointed. He didn't need Alan to be perfect. He just needed him to keep going, to keep trying. And Alan had been doing just that. The changes were slow but steady, like the gentle, unrelenting rhythm of a river carving its way through stone. Alan had started taking more ownership of the company. He was listening more to the employees, focusing on the company's core values, and making decisions with integrity instead of chasing after quick results. One evening after another, long day at work, Alan came home and sat down next to Robert on the porch. The sky was painted in hues of pink and orange as the sun set behind the trees. The sound of crickets filled the air, and the quiet was more comforting than ever before. Alan didn't speak at first, just sitting there, looking out over the yard, as if trying to find the right words. "Dad," Alan finally said, his voice low but steady. "I've been thinking about everything about the company, about how I've treated you. I know I've let you down. I know I've been running from a lot of things I didn't want to face, but I want you to know I'm ready to face them now." Robert listened quietly. He had heard Alan speak like this before, but something about the way he said it this time made Robert believe it. It was no bravado, no defensiveness, just honesty. And Robert knew this was the moment that Alan had finally come to understand. Something that had eluded him for so long. Life wasn't about avoiding failure. It was about facing it, learning from it, continuing to move forward. "I don't know how to make up for everything," Alan continued, his voice breaking slightly, "but I'm going to try. I'm going to make things right, not just with you, but with myself." Robert put a hand on Alan's shoulder, a simple gesture, but one that meant everything. "You don't have to make it all right, Alan. You don't have to fix everything. Just keep going, keep learning, and remember that mistakes don't define who we are. What matters is what we do after we make them." Alan nodded, his eyes filled with emotion. The weight of his father's words seemed to sink in deeply. This wasn't about making everything perfect. It was about making progress, about striving to be better every day. Over the next few months, Alan continued to grow, not just in his role at the company, but in his understanding of life and his relationship with Robert. He wasn't the same young man who had once thought everything was owed to him. He was someone who was willing to face the consequences of his past mistakes and take ownership of his future. As Robert sat in the quiet of the house one evening, reflecting on how far Alan had come, he realized something important. It wasn't the money or the company that truly mattered. It was the lessons passed down through generations, the integrity that was built over time, and the relationships that were nurtured through honesty, love, and understanding. Robert had always hoped that Alan would carry on the legacy he had built, but now he saw that it wasn't just about carrying it forward. It was about Alan creating his own version of that legacy, one that was based on respect, responsibility, and a deep understanding of what it meant to live a life of purpose. The lesson Robert had learned through all of this was simple, yet powerful. True strength is not in avoiding failure, but in learning from it, in having the courage to face it head on, and in continuing to strive for what truly matters. If you found this story meaningful, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Life isn't always about the easy path. It's about the journey, the lessons, and the people we become along the way. Please leave a comment below, share your experiences, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories that touch the heart. Let's learn and grow together one step at a time.